Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us in this strange and stressful time. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore and our many wonderful co-sponsors this afternoon, I'm so pleased to welcome you to this very special program, What Just Happened? Writers Discuss the Post-Election Moment. In just a minute, I will turn you over to Askold Melnichuk, who will be introducing our program. But first, I'd like to take just a quick second to thank you all for being here and also for your generous donations. Your financial contributions make this virtual event series possible and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore in a very difficult time. Thank you for tuning in. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. This evening's panel discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, go to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and we'll get through as many as time allows. I do anticipate lots of questions, so we'll get to as many as we can. And finally, as you may have experienced in the many virtual gatherings over the last few months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm so pleased to turn things over to Askold Melnichuk, writer, editor, poet, essayist, translator, and the founder of Aerosmith Press. Askold, the digital podium is now yours. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Serena. Good afternoon. I'm a founding member of Writers Against Trump. It's been quite a week, quite a few years, and I can't think of any conversation we need more urgently than the one we're about to have. Before introducing our extraordinary panel, I want to thank Jeff Mayerson of the Harvard Bookstore for hosting us and Serena Longo for coordinating our Zoom session. It was their visionary agreement to this event that has sparked a series of other similar events across the country. 3 months ago, 11 of us began meeting in anticipation of this week's election, asking ourselves what role we as writers might play in this transformative national moment. We proposed a number of answers. This conversation is one of them. As I said, a version of today's discussion is taking place right now in bookstores around the country. Later this evening, at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, there will be a national webinar moderated by Paul Auster with guests Salman Rushdie, Natasha Trethewey, and Rebecca Solnit. A link to it will be posted in the chat. We also invite you to send us your ideas about the work you think writers might be doing as we move into what I hope will be a new administration. Please email your suggestions to us at writersagainsttrump.org. And again, I'll post that in the chat later. Now, let me introduce our truly distinguished panel and extend our gratitude to them for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Martha Minnow is a university professor at Harvard and former dean of its law school. She teaches and writes about constitutional law and human rights. Her most recent book is When Should Law Forgive? She served as the clerk to Justice Thurgood Marshall of the United States Supreme Court. Reverend Mariama White-Hammond, the founding pastor of New Roots AME Church in Dorchester, is an advocate for ecological and social justice, youth engagement, and spirit-filled organizing. Reverend Mariama is active in secular and interfaith justice efforts. In particular, she challenges folks to see the connections between immigration and climate change and the relationship between energy policy and economic justice. STEPHEN GREENBLATT is University Professor of the Humanities at Harvard University. He's the author of 14 books, including Tyrant, Shakespeare on Politics, The Rise and Fall of Adam and Eve, and Will in the World, How Shakespeare Became Shakespeare. His book, The Swerve, How the World Became Modern, won both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. Timothy Snyder is the Levin Professor of History at Yale University and the author of, among other books, Our Malady, just out, On Tyranny, and The Road to Unfreedom. He's received the Hannah Arendt Prize, the Literature Award of the Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Leipzig Book Prize for European Understanding. He is speaking with us from Vienna. Finally, our moderator, James Carroll, also a founding member of Writers Against Trump, is author of 12 novels, most recently The Cloister. He received the National Book Award for his memoir, American Requiem. Other books include the New York Times bestseller, Constantine's Sword, and the forthcoming, The Truth at the Heart of the Lie. I turn it over to James.
Oscar, thank you so much for that introduction. Let me begin by joining you in thanking the Harvard Bookstore and our truly distinguished panel. What just happened? What's happening now? What must happen next? Those are the three questions around which we're imagining this conversation to take place. Obviously, this is a moment of fraught transition, and yet it's also a moment which itself cries out to be expressed, brought to the public forum, and shared widely. So let me also begin by thanking every one of you who has joined us for this conversation, and we do look forward to your participating in it. The crushing tensions of the last 3 days have felt ominous and nearly impossible to bear. Even now, we await some resolution. Our hearts will not resume a normal pulse until the definitive election of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris is declared. Even short of that much desired and rescuing climax, we already know that something momentous, perhaps catastrophic, has occurred in our country, even if it has a hopeful and promising outcome. What just happened? Well, nearly half of the American votes have been cast for Donald Trump. What is happening now? The nation and the world is shuddering as the process plays itself out to a conclusion. What must happen next? We must face the truth of what is being revealed about us as a people. I am deeply grateful to each of you for joining us, and I am honored to be here with Timothy Snyder, Reverend MARIAMA White-HAMMOND, STEPHEN GREENBLATT, and Martha Minnow. I'm inviting each of the panelists to click your video button and unmute yourselves so that we can begin to see each other. It's great to be with you again. What I said earlier was the Cambridge, Boston, New Haven, not Hollywood squares. And I'm looking forward to our conversation. Timothy Snyder, you have spent 20 years thinking about nations in life and death crises, including now our own nation. In fact, you have helped us prepare for this by your recent writing. You are in Vienna looking toward home. What do you see?
So first of all, James, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with this particular group trying to address these particular questions. We've all just got a few minutes to start, so I thought I would talk about one issue that may be of special concern to readers and to writers, which is the question of knowledge. So as James Carroll was kind enough to say, I've been writing about the history of violence for a couple of decades, and then for most of the last decade, I've been thinking about information and politics in Eastern Europe and then in the United States. And then for much of the last few years, I've been concentrating on US politics. On Monday night, I decided I would finally take a break. I decided I had done what I could do about this election, and I was going to gift myself an evening at a cafe. It was the last evening that cafes were going to be open before a lockdown in Vienna. So I took a novel, Alain Mabanco, Les Signons sont immortels, and I went to a cafe in Vienna that I like, and I sat down to read. And at that moment, about 500 meters away from me, gunfire erupted in what turned out to be a terrorist attack. So I picked up my novel. I thought for a moment about what I should do. Should I shelter here? Should I try to go farther away? I took my novel and ran, literally ran home to my kids and to my wife. And and then that, of course, that was the day before the American presidential elections. And I won't say that it's put the presidential elections in perspective, but it has meant that I've stayed away from the internet and only just briefly jumped in to see what was happening. And it's in this mood, or from this mood, that I want to make a few remarks about knowledge and about knowing. In other words, I want to talk about the question marks at the end of what just happened and what's happening now and what needs to happen. So one thing which really strikes me in this experience of watching the election is the weird way that we have too much information, right? We're drowning, America's drowning in empirical knowledge. It's as though for a moment, if you don't know the middle name of every county clerk in Nevada, then you don't know anything. Suddenly, like, all this information is very important, vitally important. But I think it was T.S. Eliot who first made this distinction between the information, the knowledge, and the wisdom. What I'm struck by, I'm sure many others are too, is by the odd way that the information is out of sync, or that it's out of balance. Like it's out of balance in time, that we pay attention to each other in this strange way only every 4 years, unless you're a college football fan, are you even thinking about all these other states? And the problem isn't just a problem of the coasts looking into the middle of the country or vice versa. Like, in a way, that's a comfortable lens because it allows the coast to feel guilty. But that's not the only problem. The other problem is that most of the country can't really know itself at this point, because most of the country is a news desert at this point. I mean, technically a news desert. There aren't local newspapers with proper reporting on most of the territory of the United States measured by counties, which means that inside the country, people are also not capable of talking to one another. So it's not the case that there's some deep truth in the middle of the country and that we, the coastal elites, can't get to it. It's also the case that inside the country, in most of the country, social media has driven out local news, and local knowledge and local conversations have also halted and have been replaced by concern about Washington or concern about things that are very far away. And so every 4 years, then, we have this ritual where we overwhelm certain states with political propaganda, and then we extract from states, as we're doing right now, these incredibly detailed numbers, first at the level of polls and then at the level of the voting outcome. And the polls, the polls are interesting, but like, they're interesting the same way that fantasy football, I'm sorry, I'm now stuck in a football metaphor and people have to forgive me, but they're interesting the same way that fantasy football is interesting, right? I mean, polls are to fantasy football as voting is to some actual form of sport, right? It's an interesting game, but it persuades us that we have the, quote, hard data. If you read 538, as I'm sure some of you do, their first line of propaganda is that they're based on hard data. But it's just the data that comes from the kind of people who like to answer polls, who are not the same people who necessarily vote. But it keeps us under this illusion that we have knowledge, when really all we have are numbers. And there's this strange way, and this is my next point, that the numbers are making us stupid. That humans are not capable of talking fast enough to keep up with the numbers. If you watch the news coverage, the humans don't look very smart, do they? The humans are trying to explain this number, that number, the other number, this unexpected shift, this mirage, whatever it might be. And we're not looking very good doing it. And then meanwhile, the way the numbers hit us, this number gives us pleasure. Oh, this county in Arizona is better than we thought. This number gives us pain. Oh, they're not counting in Pennsylvania. And slowly we realize that this isn't just the election. This is how the whole internet works. This is how social media works all the time. This is how the numbers work all the time. It's a constant game to figure out what's going to give us pleasure, what's going to surprise us, what's going to give us pain, what's going to keep us online. And this makes it very hard for us to think, let alone to talk together. This way of being dominated by what on the screen, keeps us interested, not only physically crowds out local media and takes away the time we need for human contact, it also drives us into, and now I'm just getting to the heart and towards the end of what I want to say, it also drives us into a politics of us and them. So states are divided 50-50, the country is divided close to 50-50, but it's not just a division. It's unfortunately something deeper than that. It's something deeper than polarization. We're into a situation where much of what Republicans are against is the Democrats, and what the Democrats are against is the Republicans. And for all the appropriate qualifications what we have to put on that, it nevertheless means that we're in a politics where it's about us and them rather than about the future. And that's where we're driven by the lack of local color and by the lack of local factuality. And that in turn, when politics is all about us and them, when it's in this vacuum, there isn't a future. And that sets up Trump, right? This is why Trump did so well in 2016. And it's one of the reasons why he does so well in 2020, is that he's a performer. If there aren't any common facts and there isn't a future, then all that matters is performance. His only trouble now is that his coup d'etat performance, which is what we're watching, his coup d'etat performance also requires audience participation. It requires that the fourth wall comes down and the audience participates. He needs judges, he needs state officials, he needs his own supporters to carry out acts of violence. He can't do it all on his own. But this basic atmosphere creates this possibility for spectacle. So what's happening now is that our politics is becoming a politics of spectacle. Very briefly then on what needs to happen. There's so many things that need to happen. I mean, I personally have been preoccupied with healthcare, which I think is one very deep reason why there's too much anger and frustration and fear that can be channeled in our politics. But I just want to stick to this one theme, which is factuality. There's this deep and stubborn and long-held belief in Anglo-Saxon, in liberal political thought, which holds that the facts are just out there, they compete with one another, and the truth comes to the top. And that is just not true. It's never been true. And surely if we ever believed that, the last few years should have shown us that that's not true. Facts only exist because of hard work, and they only exist because of incentives and structures. The fact that we've lost local news, the fact that most of the country is a news desert is not a situation in which we can communicate, in which our elections are going to make any sense, and which we're going to be able to talk to each other. So one thing that very much needs to happen, and something that I think writers should be particularly concerned about, is that social media needs to be taxed. That tax money has to be used to support local newspapers for profit or not for profit. We have to water the news desert so that local unpredictable factuality is there for everybody. And then we won't be having these weird visitations every 4 years. And then when we ask the question, what happened, what's happening now, what needs to happen, it'll be on the basis of a much richer background. So that's what I wanted to start with. Thank you.
And thank you, Timothy. Very provocative bar you've set, and I hope we can rise to it. I'd like to turn to you, Reverend MARIAMA White-HAMMOND. Every day in your pastoral work and in your citizenship, you work for justice and are much admired for it. And every week, in fact, you preach it. You have power with young people in particular. They regard you as a kind of North Star. We're privileged to have you. What are you telling them and other people in your lives? What just happened as you see it? What's happening now? What must happen next, Reverend MARIAMA?
So I think what happened just now is not altogether different from what happened in 2016. And for those of you who know me, I did have an accident on Monday before the elections. And so you are noticing the burns on my face, but I am doing well. But I did want to give that caveat because I know people are wondering. So, I think that Donald Trump got more votes this time than he did before. Now, what I think most of the people on this call are hoping is that Joe Biden got more votes than those more votes. But the reality is, I remember back to 2016, and I remember saying to myself, I need to have more conversations. I need to figure out how we bridge this divide. And I felt a deep sense of urgency, and I want to confess that I didn't move with an urgency that I felt in those immediate moments. That I, like probably most of us, was also caught up in the idea that once he was exposed for the incompetent that he was, everybody would get clear about this and we'd move into a different direction. And so this election became about proving that actually people were tricked by him, and we're going to move in a different direction. And the reality is that this election has exposed that there is something so much deeper, something that I want to admit I recognized, talked about, and then was lulled back into doing and being relatively the same after the shock of the election faded. And so I think that this country is at a deep place of dis-ease. We are deeply fearful on all sides. And I've heard multiple people quoting this, but I'm the pastor on here, so I get to make this quote. We are at a point where we are a house deeply divided, and a house divided against itself cannot stand. And that was true when Jesus said it in the book of Matthew. It was true when President Lincoln said this shortly before the Civil War broke out at the Republican convention. And it is true now. We are deeply fearful, and I think for the majority of the country, the fear is that our quote unquote best days are behind us. That what we are going towards is painful, will be suffering, will be a struggle that we have not seen before, or that we are ill-equipped to face. And I think that there are some folks who say, let's go back to what it was. Make America great again. Let's go back to where we were before. That is the solution to not experience the imperial collapse that might be on the horizon. All empires fall. And I think we have deep fear in this country that that's maybe where we're headed. And we are positing different solutions and different approaches, but we're not having those conversations with each other. So I would say on the left, which probably where most people would find me, we have invested a whole lot in a critique about why the system is a problem. We find comfort in our critique. And ultimately, I want to be honest, I don't think we actually have that much of a vision of where we're going, but we have a comfort in our critique. And so you have these, go back to where we were, critique of what is. Neither of those is a vision of where we need to go, nor a roadmap of how we get there. And so we showed up and more or less said how we propose to deal with the dis-ease that we feel. But I have to say, I think both of those answers are losing answers. There is no going back to some other America that was. And knowing what is wrong is not the same as knowing where you need to go. And it's interesting to me because for me, I look at sort of these 4 huge things that I think are happening in this moment. One, the reality of climate change. For me, that really looms large because in many ways, we are at a moment where we actually are clear that our way of living is not just socially potentially unsustainable, but actually unsustainable at a scientific and planetary level. Like, we can't continue to live this way. We have a level of economic injustice that is growing in this country. I heard a statistic that Jeff Bezos could get all of his employees, all like 400,000 of them or something, $100,000, and he would only be as rich as he was before the pandemic. The concentration of wealth is at a scale we've never seen before. Racial justice, clearly the original sins of this nation in its relationship to Indigenous people that was called into question at Standing Rock, with Black people that has been called into question with the racial uprising of this year, and an international balance of power in which the United States is not necessarily as powerful as it used to be. The interesting thing is that when you look at what Dr. King said just before he died, he said that the three evils of this country were racism, militarism, and materialism. And quite frankly, when you look at those challenges, they deeply align with those three areas of concern. And so I think, you know, for me, what happened was predictable, even if people like me, who in theory should see that, have been myself lulled into trying to maintain the way of being that I already had. It's so normal as a pastor, you know, people come to me and they're saying, you know, I don't know how this happened. Well, do you really not know how it happened? It's so easy to see it in someone else's life. It's so hard to see the plank in your own eye. And so I don't think that what we have seen was unpredictable. I mean, the big question is, will we react differently this time versus the last time? Because it looks more or less like we're gonna basically get to 50.5 and, you know, % and win the presidency. But I do hear many people saying there is deeper work to be done. And I hope we hold that to be true. So I think we're at this moment where, again, Dr. King asked the question, where do we go from here, chaos or community? And I think we'll have an opportunity to lean into what it means to answer that question.
Reverend Mariama, thank you so much for that powerful statement. We'll follow up on some of your important points in the conversation. Stephen Greenblatt, in Tyrant, Shakespeare on Politics, you ask with Shakespeare, thinking, I believe, of Richard III and Macbeth, why would anyone be drawn to a leader manifestly unsuited to govern, someone dangerously impulsive or viciously conniving or indifferent to the truth? Shakespeare shows us, as you put it, the tragic cost of this submission. So, Stephen, for you, what just happened? What's happening now? What must happen next?
There we go. I unmuted myself. Thank you, Jim. I want to talk about a crisis, my crisis of civic imagination. Because setting aside the polls, which were, as usual, grotesquely misleading, all the serious predictions of what was likely to happen in the presidential election pointed to the place that we're at. That's why you, Jim, many weeks ago conceived this event. And yet, despite these predictions and despite my congenital pessimism, in my heart of hearts, I expected a blue wave, a landslide for Biden. Why? Because I have difficulty fully imagining myself into the minds of those who would, after all that's happened over the past 4 years, vote for Donald Trump. To be sure, I can come up with a caricature, and that caricature might actually apply to a certain number of the people who vote for Donald Trump, but it cannot account for the millions of my fellow citizens, most of them presumably decent people, concerned with the welfare of their families, their communities, and their country, who decided that they genuinely want another 4 years of what we've just experienced. And the key, I think, is that this failure of imagination, this failure of my imagination, is not only widely shared by others whose political views are similar to mine, but also that they're fully reciprocated by those on the other side who ask themselves why someone like me would vote for Joe Biden, who come up with a caricature, I presume, parallel to mine of them. I'm sorry to say that I don't have a prescription for curing this serious ailment, which Shakespeare thought could signal a breakdown of the social order and serve as a precondition for civil war. But Shakespeare's plays at least urge us to reflect on how the imagination works in political life, and in particular on how crowds, under the spell of unscrupulous leaders, are induced to unleash their fantasies. I've thought upon it, the demagogue Jack Cade tells his ardent followers in one of Shakespeare's early history plays. I've thought upon it. My mouth shall be the Parliament of England, he says. Everyone sees that Jack Cade's a liar and a fraud. Why could this possibly appeal to anyone? The answer in part is revealed by what he says when he gets his hands on one of his enemies. He says, I am the broom that must sweep the court clean of such filth as thou art. Thou hast most traitorously corrupted the youth of the realm, he says, in erecting a grammar school. And it will be proved to thy face that thou hast men about thee that usually talk of a noun and a verb, and such abominable words as no Christian ear can endure to hear, he says. Now, this is a caricature, of course, but the laughter that it provokes congeals when there are real world consequences in the play. In this case, the crowd's murder of the man who's accused of the crime of founding a school. I thought of this scene when I saw the crowd on the day before the election, the crowd, most of them not wearing masks, at Donald Trump's midnight rally in Opelika, Florida, chanting over and over, fire Fauci, fire Fauci, fire Fauci. What could they possibly be thinking of, I wondered? And what conception of electoral politics could lead Donald Trump to smile and welcome this chant? The answer, I believe, must lie in the imagination. In this case, in the fantasy that firing the doctor would cure the disease and make good on the president's grotesque claim that a disease that has killed more than 250,000 Americans was largely a doctor's plot to fill their coffers. Shakespeare did not have a confident answer for how such destructive and self-destructive exercises of the imagination could be countered. He certainly thought that simply pointing out the lies and the absurdity was not enough. He thought that laughing was not enough. He thought that rational argument was not enough. In the case of his depiction of Jack Cade, what worked, as Shakespeare imagined, was a kind of counter-imagination. The crowd in the play is wavering between Cade and his opponent, Clifford. It could go either way. And then the patriotic Clifford conjures up a vision of the rival countries that are poised to take advantage of the realm's troubles. Methinks already in this civil broil, he says, I see them lording it in London streets. This image of the nation's enemies turns the tide. In fact, we do have such enemies, the enemies of our country, the enemies of democracy. And they are, in fact, laughing at us even now, as we go through this excruciating moment. But that doesn't feel to me like the only or perhaps the right act of counter-imagination for this moment. So the question that I turn back to all of us, as MARIAMA has said, as Tim Snyder has said in different ways, is what is the right counter-imagination? What is the right way of seizing the imagination of ourselves and our fellow citizens so that we can move forward in a safer and a healthier and a more hopeful direction? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. And that is the question. Here's hoping we can be worthy of it in our conversation. Martha Minnow, in your recent book, When Should Law Forgive? You cite Nelson Mandela to say, resentment is like drinking a poison and hoping it will kill your enemies. Would you help us understand this self-killing politics of resentment into which we've descended, all of us? For you, what just happened? What's happening now? What must happen next?
Well, no matter what, we are here, and we're here to learn and to talk with one another and to support one another during these challenging times. I give my thanks to the Harvard Bookstore, to you, James Carroll, and to the superb thinkers gathered on this panel as I reflect on those questions. And I cannot help but add another, what does it mean for law, democracy, the United States, the world, and for all those being born today? What has just happened? What's happening now? What happens next? What does it mean? And I'll try to talk about that issue of resentment. I just want to note that no matter how this week turns out, what unfolds with the presidential election, the Senate, the other election returns, much as others have said here, the electoral process itself is severely broken. People standing in line for 7 hours to vote, mail-in votes that are lost, thousands of lawyers currently working on litigating the results, voter suppression, the United States Postal Service refusing to comply with a court order to locate and deliver undelivered mail ballots, saying it just preferred not to. Polling is broken, the news ecosystem is hijacked, and it both reflects and fuels the divisions over everything, and notably over just basic facts. And since 2013, when the Supreme Court blocked implementation of the Voting Rights Act, the increases in voter suppression are rampant. Scenarios now about what could happen include the risk that President Trump succeeds in casting enough doubt about the reliability of the vote to prompt state legislatures to create new slates of electors to disregard whatever the popular vote was, turning to little used and little read portions of the Constitution about the role of the House of Representatives should we not be able to elect a president. We are divided. We are divided, not necessarily even by state or geography. Increasingly, it's cities versus rural communities, the suburbs swinging back and forth. We're divided into ethnic and racial groups, white men versus others. Let's be frank, without the 15th and 19th Amendments, giving African-American men and then women the vote, this year would have been a landslide election for President Trump. I know that people are going to be sorting through the complex elements of this election for decades. The historians of 2020 will write dissertations on individual days of the year. And the analysts of the election will need to explain how Trump voters who say they're in favor of women's reproductive freedom voted for Trump, and how Trump voters voted for a $15 minimum wage in Florida and while voting for Trump, and say that they want a path of citizenship for undocumented people while voting for Trump. I am grateful that there was outcry against the separation of children and parents at the border sufficiently to push even the Trump administration away from the worst forms of its policies. But who will listen if they are still in charge? From my perspective, that 66 million people voted for a president who foments disrespect for the elections, for courts, for the media, for norms of democracy, for peaceful transition of power, who encourages racism, hatred of immigrants, hatred of people with different political views, makes fun of people with disabilities, that there are 66 million people who could vote for this man and this administration, I find so difficult to fathom. Quite apart from our party differences about healthcare or abortion or immigration, even about racism, environmental protection, COVID-19, science. This just means that we are fundamentally divided about whether we are one nation and about the roles of any of the institutions that make up this country. My father, who's about to turn 95, is a veteran of World War II. He's a true patriot. He is heartbroken. He said that he's more worried now than he was during the war because of the polarization, the divisions, the hatreds, and the lack of a shared commitment to the project of living together. I, as a child of the assassinations of JFK, Dr. Martin Luther King, and other admired leaders, I, as a child of the Vietnam era, the Watergate, I maybe didn't have as many rosy hopes for this country, but I cannot get over the millions of people who voted for a man who was morally bankrupt and who willfully sacrifices the lives of others for his own self-interest without any reluctance to tear down democracy, the nation, truth, and decency. And then the millions who voted for the party leaders whose silence and collaboration are, if anything, more reprehensible. Now, this is not the language of reconciliation or forgiveness, and I know that. I'm very sobered by the surveys that show that 90% of identified Republicans reportedly fear that Vice President Biden would lead the nation to socialism. And 80% of Democrats fear that Trump will lead us to tyranny, especially because I'm firmly in the second group. But amid the politics of resentment, as people blame others for our current challenges, how do we govern together? We have pressing crises in criminal justice, in the environment, in income inequality. We have crisis in the economy, small businesses, bookstores, the toxicity of the social media, not to mention COVID-19. We have to govern together. Like Timothy, I worry about the information environment, and I add the narrow casting, how we're sorted into different demographics by marketers who know what we read and look at and sort us into different groups, and we end up with different music and different entertainment, different games. We're unrooted from the physical neighborhoods. And worry about global companies where the CEOs don't even really live in a local community. They're not invested in them. And that directly affects the viability or lack thereof of local news, of local schools, of investment in local futures. Like Reverend MARIAMA, I thought myself when the 2016 election happened, it was devastating, but a fluke. And that if he wasn't impeached successfully, he was impeached, but he wasn't convicted, Trump would be repudiated in 2020. Like Stephen, I'm baffled by the preconditions for civil war that we watch around us and how crowds are mesmerized by tyrants and liars. I think I take some courage from words of others. Yesterday, the executive director of the Lawyers for Civil Rights Group, Ivan Espinoza Madrigal, said, "No one is coming to magically save us. Regardless of the outcome, we have to save ourselves and each other. Regardless of the outcome, we have to empower ourselves and each other. Regardless of the outcome, we have to build bridges across differences and forge alliances and partnerships. This work belongs to all of us. I agree with that. And I'd add the work includes rebuilding the very processes and norms of democracy, legality, decency. But how do we fuel the motivation to even want to do so? Because it turns out that freedom, democracy, truth-seeking depend on people wanting it. In Northern Ireland, during and since the peace accords, people have learned every single day you have to fight for peace. It's not something that is fixed and reliable. You have to fight for it every day. How are we going to build enough desire for that kind of fight? And for the fight involved in reckoning with our starkly different views of our history and our present and our hopes and over who to trust, it's going to take really hard work. It's going to require spending time working together with people with whom we disagree. Kathy Kramer, who wrote the book Politics of Resentment, reports that in Wisconsin, people in rural communities are convinced that people in cities and politicians disrespect their distinct values. How do we convey respect when at the moment we may not feel it? I worry that what's at jeopardy right now is the very project of the Enlightenment. The idea that by talking together, by sharing information, by being educated and educating others, by developing science, we could build better societies, more inclusive, more tolerant, more pluralist. I worry that that itself is what's on the chopping block. And it's on the chopping block in part because we're not embodied and don't actually spend time shoulder to shoulder with each other rather than watching screens. French observer of early America, Alexis de Tocqueville, said, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults." That's the question on the table right now. Can we repair the faults? Do we want to? Ruth Bader Ginsburg quoted that and then turned to another great quotation from Judge Learned Hand, the American jurist, about liberty, and said that liberty must lie in the hearts of men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the mind of others. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs their interests alongside its own without bias. That's what's in jeopardy right now. Can we find that spirit of liberty to have enough humility to imagine there might be another way of thinking, even though I, at this moment, am convinced that my way is right? Can we be humble enough to pursue our own truths in order to find truth, and compassionate enough to build on a future for those who are younger than we are? And if we can't do that, I fear for us all.
Martha, thank you for that stirring statement. And I also want to acknowledge a debt to your father, and thank you for invoking his name, although you didn't give us his full name. Those of us of a certain age have been haunted forever by the phrase he coined, a vast wasteland, which has taken on ever more resonance, largely in terms of the difficulties and challenges that all four of you speakers have laid out just now. Timothy Snyder has obligations in Vienna that are going to take him away from us before we're concluding at 6 o'clock. So I want to invite you in now, Tim. All four of you, Martha just invoked the politics of resentment. Stephen talked about the crisis of civic imagination. Reverend Mariama talked about the deeper work that must be done, plunging well below the simple problem of Donald Trump. You yourself talked about the politics of us and them. And Martha just gave us a good example of what that politics looks like in one person of integrity who still is capable of saying, my way is right. Say another word about your view of the politics of us and them, and how we, on the one hand, must continue to affirm the truth as it is given to us, especially when it's matters of life and death, and how, on the other hand, we must find ways of respectfully encountering those with whom we very significantly disagree. What's the way out of the politics of us and them that you sketched?
Well, thank you for your generosity in indulging my having to leave a little bit early. I want to start from maybe a surprising place in answering that question. I mean, you used the phrase, James Carroll used the phrase life and death. So I want to start with life and death, because I think that's part of the basic problem that will have to be addressed. We're in a country where infant mortality is getting worse. We're in a country where if you're an African-American woman, there are 70 other countries you could go to around the world to give birth to your baby, where you and your baby will be more likely to survive. If you're an American, that number is around 40, maybe larger. We're in a country where life expectancy peaked in 2014. All of these things are shocking to Europeans or Japanese or South Koreans or people in countries that we used to call comparable. And I think this is a deep part of the problem. If people are not thinking so much about the future, it's partly because they're expecting less from their own lives. If millennials aren't thinking about the future, it's partly because they correctly believe they're going to spend more on healthcare and die younger than their parents and their grandparents. And if Americans are primed for authoritarianism, I think that's partly because all of us, or almost all of us, who go through the healthcare system are being exposed to unnecessary and unpredictable pain. And when pain is normal in the most intimate parts of life, I think it becomes normal also in politics. I think this works in a number of ways, but I think the simplest way Donald Trump has already shown us this year, 2020, if everyone thought that coronavirus was going to be just a disadvantage to him, we've now realized that that's not the case. Sure, some people probably voted against him because of the coronavirus, but it also created additional reserves of anxiety and fear and pain and resentment, which he could then turn in other directions. And this is a theme I want to pick up from Stephen and from Martha Minnow, and really from everyone, that if politics is about us and them, that's partly because there's a lot of anger built into the system for non-political reasons. And if we want to solve that, like that one of the things we have to do in the future is make healthcare more accessible. If only for this reason. There are lots of other reasons, but I think if only for this reason. Now, moving towards my second part of the answer, about how to get rid of us and them. I mean, my first part is you can drain some of the anger and resentment and pain from the system by having something which looks more like a welfare state. But another part of the answer is that the politics of us and them is about being against things. So when we ask the question, how could all these people have wanted 4 more years of Trump? I'm not sure that all of them actually want something positive, even something so simple as 4 more years of Trump. A lot of it is just not wanting things. I mean, not wanting communism or not wanting socialism, or not wanting people in power who murder babies, right? I mean, hard as it is to believe, and now we're going into the Martha Minnow's worry about enlightenment. Half Republicans polled believe that Democratic elites are engaged in killing babies and sexual conspiracies with babies, right? Half. So if that's naturally, if you believe that, you're going to be against it, right? You're going to be against it. I mean, I realize this, we're now in Stephen's world of the imagination, but if you believe that, then naturally you're going to oppose it. You're going to oppose it with passion. you're going to go and vote. But my point is that I'm not sure that people are so much for Trump as they are against other things. And then Democrats are, of course, falling into this trap because we're against Trump. And so I want to close by repeating and maybe rephrasing a little bit Reverend Mariama's point about the future. A problem that the Democrats and the left has had has been that we've had a kind of mechanical or technocratic version of the future, that the economy was going to bring a better version of the future. That could be a Marxist view, but it can also be a capitalist view. There's no alternative. Capitalism is going to make things better, right? I think what we have to realize is that there is no technocratic version of the future. There is no deterministic vision of the future. We can't get to the future without projecting a lot of ethics into it, because the future isn't just about what's gonna automatically happen and then claiming that that had to be and is therefore good. The future has to be about not just an aesthetic view, but also an ethical view of what should be. And I think too many folks on the left have farmed off the ethical to the religious right. And we can't get away with that anymore. We have to reclaim the ethical in the sense of what a beautiful, much better future would be like. Because the only way out of the politics of us and them is to get ourselves out of the immediate present, where our immediate feelings against the other seem like the only thing that matters. I believe the only way to do that is for writers and others to try to claw our way back into better images of what the future can be like. So thanks.
Timothy, thank you so much for being with us. And we're very grateful to you. And I think the cliched farewell, be well, has a new resonance for you in Vienna there. And hope you and your family are continue to be safe. Thanks very much for being with us. Thanks
to everyone for listening, and thanks for the conversation.
Mariama, I'm struck that both you and Stephen Snyder, while firmly repudiating the values represented by Trump, also found it necessary to have a self-critical thought as persons of the left. I recognize in what he just said an echo of what you were saying when you talked about the comfort we take in our critique of the other. Would you jump in here and offer us your thought?
So one of the key things that I work on is climate change. And one of the challenges, and this is actually bearing out in research, one of the ways we have approached this issue is that we really need everyone to understand how dire the situation is. And so folks really invested a lot of energy into clarifying the urgency of the situation. And it, in many ways, has not necessarily been helpful, and in some cases has made people less inclined to care about the issue. And so I think, I thank Timothy for his notion that when we lean into the politics of fear, we think we can just dip into it and then move to rationality, like, oh, well, we're just gonna put that out there so that you can like process it, and then we're gonna tell you like where we need to go. But the reality is that the depth of fear that we are at a point where folks are traumatized. The level of fear is really deep. And I think there is a resentment, because there is some group of us that, even though we may have some level of fear, we have a level of material comfort that many of the folks who feel deep fear don't have. And so there is, I believe that basically there is mostly fear all around. But I definitely believe that there is some group of people who feels not just fearful, but deeply unstable, feel like what they have is sort of out of grasp and slipping away. Now, I want to be real, that I have some frustration around that narrative, because as a Black woman, some of the stuff that they're worried about losing is stuff I've never had to begin with, right? And stuff that they've been okay with me not having to begin with. So I'm not, and I can't be agnostic about that reality. That is true. And that being said, as someone who's experienced the reality of erasure, someone who has experienced what it means not to be seen, I can only imagine how overwhelming that is when that's not your lived consistent experience, and then it happens to you later in life, right? It's been painful enough for me, and it's been the reality ever since I was born. And I had a whole community of people that said, here's how we negotiate and navigate that, because we've all been through it. What happens when you start to feel that in your 20s, in your 30s, in your 50s? Panic, the panic makes sense to me. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's fair. I'm saying it makes sense. And so this question of what does it mean to imagine a world where there isn't erasure, where really all lives matter? And I do think to some extent this plays out a little bit in the conversation around abortion. And you know, again, I probably have a more nuance than most folks. I don't consider myself exactly in the pro-life or pro-choice. I'm definitely not, like, no pro-choice lifer would say I'm part of their group, but I don't fully fit 100% in your traditional pro-choice categories either, because I do think there is a critique around a society in which we have to be really careful about who matters and doesn't matter. I do think that the lines around what point we respect life or don't are ethically challenging lines we should be looking at really deeply. And sometimes the way that conversation emerges in its sort of highly partisan and divisive form means I don't think that conversation is happening in a good way on either side of that debate, right? So I think the challenge for me is that when the only force that can overcome fear that I know of is love. And the hardest time to access that love is when you are deeply fearful. But it, for me, really is the only possibility. And I think Martha names how do we access that if we don't even necessarily believe we're all in this together? If we have an illusion on both sides that we can ignore that other group and move forward. I think the truth is a bunch of us wanted a landslide because we felt like we can ignore that group. We can hope that it's going to shrink, and we can hope that it's going to, something is going to happen and it will cease to exist and we'll go back to whatever world we were trying to build. And I think we are at a pivotal moment, and nobody can ignore this. Now, one of the things I will say as a pastor is, and my challenge is to those of us who call ourselves Christians, is I think we can have an outsized role in being a bridge in this conversation. I do think we do. It's not perfect. I'm sure there are evangelicals who would say, like, I mean, actually, I've gotten Twitter messages from evangelicals who tell me that, I can't be a Christian because I even call myself a pastor, right? Like, so there are definitely, it's not a ready, easy bridge that will reach everybody. But I do think that we do have an entree to build a bridge and facilitate a conversation that might have a possibility to radiate out and help move us in a different place. But it has to start from the recognition we cannot dig out of this with just our tribe. There's no way either side is gonna just like dig out and let the other group, sort of die off. That is a pipe dream. Let it go. And I don't think, Martha, we have all the answers. I don't think, but I do wanna name one piece that I think, now I wrote this down. So I'm just finding
let me get Stephen in here to address some of the very things you're bringing up right now. Stephen, civic imagination, Is that plea we hear from Mariama your plea?
I was thinking, thank you. I was thinking when Mariama was speaking just now, actually, it's a question for all of us, but perhaps most of all for Martha. I agree with Mariama that the environmental catastrophe that we actually all in our rational moments understand is coming, is actually already upon us. And other factors like globalism and the disruptions of globalism and the healthcare system that breakdowns that Tim was talking about, and the loss of white privilege that has seen, the threatened loss of white privilege that seems to be motivating so many of these voters, that these are all incredibly intense factors. But the question is, how in our system, in a democratic system with elections, do we deal with people who say, the environment, there is no environmental crisis. Screw the environment. This is not our problem. Globalism? No, we'll reject the rest of the world. Healthcare? The hell with it. Fire Fauci. And we'll retain our white privilege. And they get incredible votes, numbers of votes. So how in a democratic system where we have to rely on, and we are facing at this moment, as Martha suggests, a kind of crisis of our basic conviction that the democratic system is the best thing we have. So how do we hold on to that system in the face of people? We're in the 1930s in Weimar. We're in the face of people who are willing to lie, say things that are manifestly untrue, but that satisfy your fantasy that it will all go away, that there is not going to be an environmental problem, that there is, even though your granny is dying in the nursing home, but you claim that there's no problem with COVID and so forth. I mean, that's the profound, it seems to me, question of what our system will offer. And here I have to say, Reverend Mariama, that my first bulwark is not faith in God, but in faith in the law. But maybe that's naive, Martha will tell me, that what might protect us for a while is that we have a kind of relatively stable legal system that will keep the worst catastrophes from happening in the situation that we're in. I want to trust, I hope, the legal system that we have at this moment to hold against the tremendous pressures that are upon it.
At that point,
Martha, you could tell me that I'm being very naive.
No, that's a very important point, and it is to Martha that we should turn with it. And I'd like to combine it with a question we have. I'm reading the questions, folks, and we'll try to feed questions in now. Roberto Olivares asks, how do you see the Biden administration, please God, that's my comment. How do you see that the Biden administration can move forward regarding human rights crimes committed during the Trump administration? Martha, your plea for forgiveness in the law, Stephen's challenge to you about, is the law something that will protect us at this moment? What's your thinking at this point about it?
Oh boy, these are the hard questions that, other than the election, have been keeping me up at night. We have watched a Senate confirm 30 people to the federal judiciary who refused to say that Brown versus Board of Education was rightly decided. Does that give me confidence in the rule of law? These are now federal judges who have life tenure who won't actually say that an existing precedent more than 60 years old is still good law. I do believe that the framers of the Constitution had one thing right, which was that human nature is filled with ambition and competition. And so the idea of yoking ambition to fight against ambition lies at the heart of our country's legal system, with the separation of powers. The courts are supposed to monitor what happens with the executive and the Congress and vice versa, and the courts, the federal government and the legislatures of the states and the judiciaries of the states are supposed to watch each other. I have some hope that there are judges who care about the viability of that system, if only for their own ambition, their own reputations, and to watch the respect of their institutions die on their watch is against their self-interest. I'm kind of counting on that, but it's not a very strong faith. You know, as much as I think there are crimes to charge against not only President Trump himself, but many, many people in this administration, human rights violations, violations of US law about corruption, there is a real risk of, even if there were political will to do something about that, that's more of the politics of resentment. That's more of the politics of hatred. Is there a path forward that involves identifying what happened and what's wrong, but doing it in a way that acknowledges the failings on many, many sides? That's the only way in which a retrospective approach to blame will be helpful in the future. I think much more that we really do need to talk about rolling up our sleeves to work on our common situation. And I can't think of nothing more pressing than the environment. I'm heartened, frankly, by the reports I hear from a town like South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina, very Republican, very different than anything that I've known, but they know they're about to be underwater. They know that their way of life is it's not an abstract thing. They're not going to exist anymore. And my colleague, Susan Crawford, is spending a lot of time there finding that people faced with that kind of a crisis know they have to put aside the other differences and work together. There isn't any choice. And the idea that you can drill a hole in the boat under your own seat and it doesn't affect anybody else is not possible under these circumstances. So it's not faith in law, it's actually a faith in the crises that are upon us that gives me some hope that we'll all have enough humility to say, I don't have the answers, but I'm willing to work.
Jan Warfield asks, and I'll put this to you, Reverend Mariama, how can we ever come together if we are divided on what we actually believe?
So I would say I have a farm in New Hampshire, so I spend some time there. And there's a gentleman from who I buy my garlic seed, and we have radically different views of the world. I remember when I was calling him to say, you know, we were trying to figure out when I was going to pick up the seed, and I had a fever the day before, so I was trying to be super careful and blah, blah, blah. And he was like, oh yeah, this whole COVID thing is going to be done after the election anyway. And I was like, he was like, yeah, it was all just a plot to push out Trump. And I was like, you know, that was our very first conversation. But since then, we've actually had more conversations and are able to have some like critical conversations, even around race, right? And so I think that one, proximity matters. And the fact that housing segregation has increased since, you know, in the 60s and 70s, we actually tried to pay attention and we tried to shift some of those things. But if you look, there's ways in which we are increasingly dividing ourselves. And then there's a reality that we spend so much time on social media that we don't even actually have to interact with anyone. But I do think it's really important for us to be in spaces with each other, because I do think that there is a whole group of people who think that everyone who supports Biden is an anarchist with Antifa looking to create a revolution, take over the country, and vice versa. They're all Michigan militia types that are, you know, looking for their KKK membership in the mail. And when we have these notions of who we are, until we challenge those, I don't see how we actually start having some of those conversations. So I do think proximity matters. I've been thinking a lot about the fact that I live in Massachusetts, but I live 1 hour in each direction from the 3 whitest states in America, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine.
Mhm.
What is the conversation I need to do? And now, as a New Hampshire farmer, what are the opportunities I have for those conversations that I could take advantage of if I just committed to leaning into them? And so I think all of us, if we looked at our lives, there are openings there. Could we be leaning into them? Because I don't see, and as much as I believe in the democratic system, I actually don't think it's going, I don't think the right level is at a national level. If we're gonna have these conversations in democracy, then it's gotta be at the town council level. It's gotta be at a much more relational level, just like you talked about in Charleston. That's where the deliberation and the relationship building and the pushing of our negative notions of each other can really thrive. But it will be hard to do that if we continue to move more and more into enclaves where the only people I see or hang out with see the world exactly the same way I do, because that makes it easier for me not to do that work and for me to demonize that other side, fit them more and more into that caricature, because nothing is challenging those notions.
A perfect description of Stephen's crisis of civic imagination. Stephen, Daniel asks, says, sometimes I feel like the obsession with Trump is more reflection on and view of him as a celebrity, not a president with responsibilities. Any thoughts on how celebrity culture has altered democracy? Any thoughts on what Shakespeare character would most resemble Trump?
I think that Shakespeare was fascinated by how certain people, and he thinks of it particularly with, yes, I'm on, good. I was afraid I was muted.
Keep going.
I was thinking about especially tyrants, how they operate as kind of brainworms, and they get in your head and you can't get them out. Shakespeare was fascinated because he was in the business of trying to produce such things in some ways, because they're thrilling in a way. And I do think that one of the things that's been brilliant in an appalling way about Donald Trump is that we spend a grotesque amount of time with him, thinking about him, with him, and I want to get him out of my head. One of the reasons I hope this election is resolved in the way I hope it is, I never want to hear that voice again. I never want to see that face again. But he's been startlingly good at making himself enter into our consciousness constantly and into our unconscious as well. And I think Shakespeare did deeply think about this, how this happens. I think he thought it was a theatrical effect, as you suggest, something to do with celebrity. But I think he thought also it was produced by a certain kind of personality. Shakespeare, perhaps, it seems too simple, thought it had to do, in the case of Richard III, with a bad relationship to your mother. So you're constantly trying to get your mother's attention. And be taken in by your mother. This seems perhaps like slightly simple-minded account, but something in the drive to get into your mind seems to have been profoundly successful in a, I think, extremely unhappy way. I think one of the odd things about Joe Biden is he can't possibly inhabit your mind in the same way, in the way that actually Obama didn't also. There were whole long periods in which you didn't think about him because you could go about your life. You could do what Reverend Mariama suggests, have just ordinary relations to people of all kinds of ordinary people in your immediate life. But one thing we're experiencing, and we're now at the crescendo of it, and please, this will come to an end, is the sense that it's just occupying way too much mental space so that you can't actually think about the things that you should think about, your friends, your neighbors, the things you should do for your own immediate environment and to make your world better. And I hope that we'll get to that place, maybe even begin to get to it in the next 24 to 48 hours. but we shall see.
Thank you, Stephen. We're drawing near the close, folks, but we still have time for one or two other questions. Lloyd Schwartz, and I'm going to put this to you, Martha. Lloyd Schwartz asks, what are the chances this election will be decided by the Supreme Court?
Well, I'll never say never, but I think it's unlikely. I think that Bush versus Gore was quite unusual. And even the court, in its own opinion, said this is not a precedent for anything. But more to the point, of the lawsuits that have been filed up to this moment by the Trump administration, people who are election law experts, much more than I am, people who I very much highly regard, say that these are small bore cases. These are not going to anything serious and don't affect many votes. And that means that this is not likely to then be rising to the level of the Supreme Court. That said, very worrying, a concurring opinion by Justice Kavanaugh coming out of emergency request of the Republicans challenging the Pennsylvania practices, said we may be back here. But here, when I mentioned before the ambition of individuals put into positions of power, I am thinking about the others on that court who will care about the reputation of the court. So to reach out and snatch an issue that is not a serious issue as an excuse to alter democratic politics would so devastate any remaining respect for that institution that I think it's unlikely that Chief Justice John Roberts will want to do that, and even a few of the others.
Thank you for that clear statement. I wish it could be published. Well, it's amazing how fast 90 minutes can pass when there's a thoughtful, important conversation underway. It is time for us to draw to a conclusion, and I'd like to invite each of the three of you to say a final word. Reverend Mariama, would you offer your final word to us and to the people who are with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the charge going forward is really to cultivate our imagination and to begin the process of, in conversation with our neighbors, asking, where do we want to go from here? You know, that will require building some bridges. And that will require all of us pushing ourselves and being willing at times to admit that we do not know. I think that I thank you for raising that, Martha, that powerful reality of saying, I do not know, but I choose to walk and figure it out with you. I think it's our only way forward. And as much as I care about the election and want it to be resolved, I think that work is the work of small p politics, much more than our institutional systems. And if we don't do that work, I think we will deepen the crisis of our political system because we will not have the societal cohesion on which that system relies.
Thank you so much. Stephen, a last word from you.
Well, I think I'll give the last word that if I can speak to Shakespeare, this from Measure for Measure. Man, proud man, dressed in a little brief authority, most ignorant of what he's most assured, like an angry ape, plays such fantastic tricks before high heaven as makes the angels weep, who, with our spleen, would all laugh themselves mortal. Laughing or weeping, we can decide which we're doing at this moment.
Perhaps a bit of both. Thank you so much for that. And Martha, a last word from you.
Well, I embrace what my colleagues have said here. I want to urge myself and others to reach out to someone with whom we disagree to have a conversation about what we do share, which is a future. I do want to put on the table what I thought we would be talking about if a blue wave had succeeded. I thought that the next frontier of human rights and human liberty would be to deal with the increasing algorithmic future that's sorting out the information we see, deciding the candidates for jobs, and assigning police based on past practices. Now I think those algorithms have designers who can't explain or bear responsibility for what's resulting. And that is part of our condition. So I think we need what some people call a tech Shabbat. We need to turn it off more often and turn to our neighbors and talk with them.
And thank you so much for that, Martha. Ladies and gentlemen who have been with us through this conversation, especially those of you who contributed questions, and I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. I want to thank you all so much. I want to repeat Osgold's thanks to Jeff Mayerson, the proprietor of the Harvard Bookstore, all of the Harvard Bookstore people, especially Serena Longo, whose work set us up today. I want to thank Osgold himself, and thank the three of you, Reverend Mariama, so much, Stephen, Martha, and if I can presume, on Timothy Snyder's behalf, I'd like to quote something he wrote in his book on tyranny as his last word. We are no wiser than the Europeans who saw democracy yield to fascism, Nazism, or communism. Our one advantage is that we might learn from their experience. And I'd conclude again by thanking all of you, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll hand it over for a final word to Serena.
That was really powerful. Thank you all. A huge thanks to you, Jim, for your moderation, and to our many, many co-sponsors, and of course, our extraordinary panelists. And to all of you out there, thank you for being here and for taking part in this timely, important conversation. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, keep reading, keep engaging, and take care of yourselves in this stressful time. Be well.